Have you ever had a place that seemed to remember you, even when the rest of the world moved on? A place where the air felt different, softer somehow, and the sound seemed to slow the beating of your heart. Down by a quiet creek, there stands an old apple tree. It has been there longer than anyone in town can recall. Through harsh winters, bright summers, and countless springs when the blossoms floated like pale snow over the water, people pass it without much thought. Yet for those who have truly stood beneath its branches, time feels as if it bends, stretching out into something gentler, kinder. Tonight we'll walk together along the worn path that leads to that tree. We'll listen to the water, breathe in the scent of ripening apples, and let the day slip quietly away. And perhaps as the evening deepens, you'll discover that the old apple tree remembers you too. So, make yourself comfortable, and let's begin our journey to the creek. The afternoon had settled into that soft, unhurried light that comes near the end of a summer's day. The sun no longer blazed overhead, but hung lower, spilling gold across the pasture, touching each blade of grass as though it wanted to remember their shape. There was a kindness to the air, a gentleness that asked for nothing more than to be noticed. Samuel sat on the porch of his farmhouse, the old boards beneath him warm from the day's sun. From where he sat, he could see the rise of the distant hill, the pale shimmer of the creek winding its way through the meadow below, and just beyond it, the shape of the old apple tree. Its branches reached out over the water as if they'd grown to greet the stream, or perhaps to protect it. He had looked at that tree almost every day of his life. In some seasons, it wore blossoms so pale they caught the light like fresh snow. In others, it carried fruit that blushed red and green, heavy enough to bend the branches toward the earth. And there were days, like this one, when the tree stood in full leaf, neither in bloom nor in harvest, simply existing in the ease of summer's height. A breeze came up from the creek, cool against the skin, carrying with it the faint scent of water and leaves. Samuel closed his eyes and let the feeling wash over him. There was no hurry in this kind of wind. It didn't demand you to notice it, and yet it stayed long enough for you to realize it was there. It rustled the porch rafters, passed through the fields, and stirred the apple tree's leaves in a way that sounded almost like a voice speaking in another language, one made not of words, but of rhythm and patience. It had been a long day, though not a hard one. He had spent the morning mending a bit of fence and the afternoon stacking wood in the shed. There was satisfaction in work like that, the kind you could see with your own eyes, feel in the strength of your arms. Still, his legs ached in that quiet way that only age could bring, and his thoughts drifted toward the kind of rest that isn't just for the body. From the porch, the path to the tree was clear in his mind, though it had softened over the years. Grass had grown over parts of it, and in springtime, wild violets liked to settle themselves along its edges. When he was a boy, he had run down that path so many times he could have found it blindfolded. Back then, the tree had seemed impossibly large, a whole world contained in its branches. He remembered climbing high enough to see over the bend of the creek, the way the water curved out of sight before joining the river beyond the hills. He thought of his father's voice, steady, low, telling him how the tree had been planted by Samuel's grandfather. "It'll outlast us all," his father had said, half in jest but half in truth. And it had. Seasons had passed, storms had come and gone, but the tree still stood in that same spot, its roots deep in the earth, its branches marking the slow passage of years. As the day began its quiet descent toward evening, the light shifted. Shadows lengthened across the pasture, and the creek caught the sun in pieces, scattering them like coins over its surface. Samuel leaned forward on the porch rail, watching how the water moved, never hurried but never still. It reminded him of how time itself worked, steady, unnoticed until you looked back and realized how far you'd come. A pair of barn swallows darted overhead, their wings cutting through the still air with quick, precise strokes. They circled once, then twice, before disappearing beyond the apple tree's crown. The leaves shivered slightly as they passed, catching the last of the day's brightness. Samuel took in a slow breath, letting it fill him from the chest to the belly. The air was different out here than anywhere else, cleaner somehow, as though it had been filtered through years of growing things. The scent of the fields mixed with the faint sweetness of the apple tree, even from this distance. He thought of the times his mother had baked apple pie from its fruit, the way the house would fill with warmth and spice, how she would let the crust cool just enough before slicing it into generous wedges. He had not eaten apple pie in years, yet the memory of it rose as vividly as if it were on the table before him. That was the way with certain places and certain scents. They held pieces of you ready to be returned without warning. A part of him wondered, not for the first time, if the tree remembered him in the same way. Trees lived so much longer than people. They stood through decades of seasons, keeping silent watch as one generations replaced the next. And yet, in their stillness, there was something that felt like memory. The way they leaned into the light, the way they held the same shape against the horizon year after year. The thought brought a faint smile to his face. Below, along the creek bank, a patch of reeds swayed gently. He could hear the subtle splash of water against stone, the murmur of current moving around a bend. It was the same sound he had heard as a child, lying on the grass with his hands behind his head, staring at the drifting clouds while the creek sang its endless song. The sun had dropped lower now, the fields bathed in a softer amber glow. The old apple tree stood in silhouette against the sky, its shape so familiar, Samuel felt he could trace it in his sleep. And maybe, he thought, that was exactly what he needed tonight. To walk down the path once more, to sit beneath those branches, and let the hours stretch into something slow and forgiving. He stayed on the porch a little longer, just listening to the creek, to the quiet rustle of the leaves, to the way the air seemed to settle around him like a worn quilt. There was no rush to go. In the country, you learned that the world would wait for you, and that sometimes the best thing you could do was let it. Samuel rose from his chair slowly, the kind of unhurried motion that comes when there's nothing pressing ahead of you and nothing behind you that can't wait. The porch boards gave a soft creak under his weight, a familiar sound that had been part of his days for as long as he could remember. He placed his hat on his head out of habit rather than need. The evening light was gentle now, with no edge to it, and rested his hand on the worn porch rail for a moment before stepping down. The grass in the yard brushed against his boots as he crossed toward the old gate. He had built that gate with his father in the summer after his 12th birthday, hammering each nail while his father held the board steady. The wood had weathered since then, turned silver gray, and the hinges were mottled with rust. Still, when Samuel lifted the latch, it opened without protest, swinging out into the pasture as though it had been waiting for this small journey all day. Beyond the gate, the path stretched ahead, faint but still there, a narrow ribbon of pressed earth winding between tufts of grass and patches of clover. Wildflowers had claimed much of its edges, Queen Anne's lace with their lace-like crowns, purple asters bowing slightly in the breeze, and the last of the summer daisies, their petals tinged with gold from the setting sun. Samuel stepped carefully, not wanting to crush them. The air smelled of hay and earth, with the hint of the creek's coolness riding the breeze. It was the sort of scent that settled deep in your chest, that stayed with you even when you closed your eyes at night. He could hear the faint trickle of water ahead, a sound so steady it might have been part of the air itself. Each step seemed to loosen something in him, not just in his legs, but in the parts of his mind that had been cluttered with small worries. Out here, those worries thinned, as if the open space and the steady rhythm of walking could scatter them like seeds carried off on the wind. The pasture rolled gently toward the creek, and Samuel paused partway to take it in. From here, he could see the apple tree's broad crown leaning over the water, the late light caught in its leaves. The branches swayed slightly, as though greeting him from a distance. He smiled to himself, feeling the same quiet welcome he had felt 100 times before. The sound of crickets began to weave itself into the air, their steady chorus blending with the distant call of a mourning dove. Somewhere far to the west, a tractor engine droned for a moment before falling silent. These were the small stitches that held the fabric of the countryside together, sounds that told you where you were without needing to see a thing. He passed the place where the fence dipped low, the spot where he and his boyhood friends used to climb over to play in the meadow beyond. The grass there was higher now, left uncut, and the seed heads swayed like a slow-moving tide. As he walked, Samuel rose from his chair slowly, the kind of unhurried motion that comes when there's nothing pressing ahead of you and nothing behind you that can't wait. The porch boards gave a soft creak under his weight, a familiar sound that had been part of his days for as long as he could remember. He placed his hat on his head out of habit rather than need. The evening light was gentle now, with no edge to it, and rested his hand on the worn porch rail for a moment before stepping down. The grass in the yard brushed against his boots as he crossed toward the old gate. He had built that gate with his father in the summer after his 12th birthday, hammering each nail while his father held the board steady. The wood had weathered since then, turned silver gray, and the hinges were mottled with rust. Still, when Samuel lifted the latch, it opened without protest, swinging out into the pasture as though it had been waiting for this small journey all day. Beyond the gate, the path stretched ahead, faint but still there, a narrow ribbon of pressed earth winding between tufts of grass and patches of clover. Wildflowers had claimed much of its edges, Queen Anne's lace with their lace-like crowns, purple asters bowing slightly in the breeze, and the last of the summer daisies, their petals tinged with gold from the setting sun. Samuel stepped carefully, not wanting to crush them. The air smelled of hay and earth, with the hint of the creek's coolness riding the breeze. It was the sort of scent that settled deep in your chest, that stayed with you even when you closed your eyes at night. He could hear the faint trickle of water ahead, a sound so steady it might have been part of the air itself. Each step seemed to loosen something in him, not just in his legs, but in the parts of his mind that had been cluttered with small worries. Out here, those worries thinned, as if the open space and the steady rhythm of walking could scatter them like seeds carried off on the wind. The pasture rolled gently toward the creek, and Samuel paused partway to take it in. From here, he could see the apple tree's broad crown leaning over the water, the late light caught in its leaves. The branches swayed slightly, as though greeting him from a distance. He smiled to himself, feeling the same quiet welcome he had felt 100 times before. The sound of crickets began to weave itself into the air, their steady chorus blending with the distant call of a mourning dove. Somewhere far to the west, a tractor engine droned for a moment before falling silent. These were the small stitches that held the fabric of the countryside together, sounds that told you where you were without needing to see a thing. He passed the place where the fence dipped low, the spot where he and his boyhood friends used to climb over to play in the meadow beyond. The grass there was higher now, left uncut, and the seed head swayed like a slow-moving tide. As he walked, the distant murmur of an evening settling in, the slow, patient heartbeat of the land itself. Here, nothing hurried. Here, nothing asked him to be anywhere else. Samuel let his back settle deeper into the curve of the trunk. The ground beneath him was a tapestry of grass, moss, and scattered fallen leaves that had dried into soft curls. A few lay close enough for him to see their veins in detail, fine branching lines like rivers on a map. The air carried the faint, sweet fragrance of ripening apples, and somewhere above, a branch creaked lightly in the breeze. Not far from his right hand, a single apple lay in the grass. It was mottled red and green with a pale spot where it had rested against the branch before falling. The skin bore a faint shine where the sun touched it between shifting shadows. He reached for it slowly, rolling it in his palm, feeling its cool weight. The fruit was firm, but not too firm, the sort that would give easily under a thumb. He remembered, with a quiet fondness, how his father had shown him the lift and twist, a way to tell when an apple was ready to leave the branch. "It'll let go when it's time," his father had said, smiling in that calm, certain way of his. Samuel had tried it countless times as a boy, some with success, some with apples dropping too soon or not at all. The memory drew him deeper to another autumn when his mother had set a basket by the kitchen door and asked him to fill it with the good ones. He could still see her in his mind, hands dusted with flour, apron tied at her waist, smiling as he brought in the day's harvest. By evening, the kitchen would be warm, and the scent of apple pie would wander through the rooms like a kind of blessing. A gentle thump pulled him back to the present. Another apple falling, this one landing somewhere behind him in the grass. He didn't turn to look. There was no need. The sound itself was enough, familiar as the rhythm of the creek. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above, breaking into shapes that shifted with each sigh of wind. The patterns moved across his hands, his shirt, the grass in front of him, as though the tree was painting with light. Every now and then a glimmer would catch on the surface of the creek, sending a ribbon of brightness downstream until it disappeared around the bend. Near the base of the trunk, the roots rose and dipped like the backs of resting animals. Between them, small plants had taken root, a cluster of violets, their petals delicate even in late summer, and tiny patches of clover. He noticed how each plant seemed to find its own place, not in competitions, but in quiet agreement, sharing the dappled shade. A honeybee drifted into view, circling lazily before settling on a clover blossom. Samuel watched its careful movements, the way it leaned into the flower as though listening to something only it could hear. The bee stayed for a long moment, then lifted off, disappearing toward the far edge of the meadow. These small, steady things, the slow fall of fruit, the drift of light, the work of a bee, were the kind that could fill an afternoon without any need for the clock. Out here, time seemed to stretch thin, not in a way that made it empty, but in a way that let it breathe. Samuel leaned his head back against the trunk, eyes half closed, and let his thoughts wander as lightly as the wind. He thought of all the days this tree had seen, mornings when the grass was silvered with frost, noons when the heat pressed down so thick you could almost hear it, and evenings when the sky burned orange before fading to blue-gray. And always, the creek beside it, moving at its own pace, carrying pieces of leaf and twig to somewhere unseen. A pair of finches landed on a low branch just above him. Their tiny feet made almost no sound, but their quiet chattering filled the air between leaf rustles. One hopped closer, tilting its head as if to take measure of him. Samuel stayed still, feeling a strange kinship with the small bird. Two creatures pausing in the same patch of shade, each content in the other's presence. From his seat, he could see the far bank of the creek, where the grass grew taller and wilder. The sun touched the tips, turning them gold against the darker green below. Every so often, a faint splash would sound, maybe a fish breaking the surface or a frog slipping back into the water. The sound was neither sharp nor sudden, but part of the landscape, as natural as the hum of the wind. He noticed, too, the way the tree's shadow stretched long across the water now, its shape gently rippling with the current. That shadow would shorten and lengthen with the day, marking time more faithfully than any clock. He thought about how many evenings he had spent watching it shift, and how each one had felt both entirely new and comfortingly the same. The air grew a touch cooler as the sun lowered, though the warmth still lingered in the grass where the light fell. Samuel reached down and picked a blade, running his fingers along its smooth length before letting it fall again. The simple act brought a quiet satisfaction, the way such a small thing could connect you to the whole of the field. Above him, a single leaf detached from its branch and drifted down in a slow spiral. He followed its path with his eyes until it came to rest near his knee. The leaf was still green but edged with the faintest hint of yellow, as if autumn had sent a gentle reminder of its approach. Samuel stayed there for a long while, listening, breathing, letting the stillness soak into him. Out here, the noise of the world seemed far away, and what remained was something older, something that had been waiting all along. The old apple tree stood as it always had, rooted, generous, and unhurried, and for this moment he felt entirely a part of it. The longer Samuel sat beneath the apple tree, the more it felt as though the world beyond the creek had faded into a softer, more distant place. There was no sound of passing engines, no voices calling from far-off porches, no reminders of things yet to be done. Only the steady hum of water over stone, the breath of wind through leaves, and the occasional unhurried thump of fruit falling into the grass. He opened his eyes fully, not because he'd been asleep, but because a changing light drew him back. The sun had dropped lower now, laying a deeper shade over the ground near the roots. The apples that had fallen there seemed to glow faintly, their skins catching what little sunlight filtered through the branches. With a slow motion, Samuel leaned forward and picked one up. The skin was cool from the shade, smooth under his palm except for the small bumps where it had rested against the branch. A pale stem curled from the top, still fresh and pliant. He turned the fruit in his hand, letting the faint scent rise, a blend of tartness and sweetness, as though the tree itself had poured the memory of summer into it. He remembered other evenings like this, decades ago, when he would come with a small basket hooked over his arm. His mother would have asked for just a few for tonight, a phrase that always meant enough for pie, enough for slices on the table, and perhaps one or two to be tucked into a pocket for later. As a boy, he had taken pride in choosing the best ones, feeling their weight, inspecting them for blemishes, and imagining the satisfaction on her face when she saw what he brought home. Samuel rose to his feet now, brushing the bits of moss and leaf from his trousers. His knees ached a little, a small reminder that time had added its own weight over the years. But it was the kind of ache that made you aware of yourself in a gentle way, not as a burden. He moved slowly around the tree, stooping to pick apples that looked whole and sound. He placed them into the fold of his shirt, holding the fabric like a makeshift basket. Each fruit seemed to carry its own shade of color. Some blushed deep red on one side and pale green on the other. Some wore a soft, even yellow. Others were mottled like the dapple of sunlight on the creek. He chose without hurry, letting his hand linger on each before deciding. As he worked, the wind shifted, bringing with it a richer scent from the meadow. The grass was still warm from the day, and the mixture of earth and sunlit stems carried a sweetness that seemed to settle in his chest. Somewhere nearby, a grasshopper sprang from the ground, its quick rustle in the grass fading as soon as it began. He found himself smiling at the simple task, this act of gathering, of bringing something home. There was a quiet purpose in it, as though each apple held not just the season's work, but a small reminder of what it meant to be connected to a place. The tree had grown these fruits slowly, without haste, and in taking them, he felt part of that rhythm. When his shirt could hold no more without spilling, Samuel sat again, arranging the apple in a small pile at his side. The colors seemed richer against the green of the grass, and he thought for a moment about how they would look on his kitchen table in the fading light of evening. He picked one more from the ground, not for the basket, but for himself, with the slow care of someone who wants to notice every part of a thing. He rubbed its skin clean against his sleeve, then brought it to his lips. The first bite was crisp, the flesh breaking with a faint snap, releasing juice that was both tart and sweet. It tasted exactly as it always had, and yet there was something about eating it here, under the very branches that had grown it, that made the flavor seem fuller, truer. Chewing slowly, he looked out toward the meadow, watching as the shadows lengthened across its surface. The sun's last strength poured a honeyed light over the tops of the grass, catching the fine threads of spiderweb strung between stems. It was the kind of light that didn't last long, but left its memory in the way you saw the land afterward. He took another bite, then another, letting the taste linger before swallowing. In the quiet between bites, he could hear the faint plop of a fish in the creek, the whisper of a leaf breaking free and drifting down, and the steady murmur of water finding its way downstream. When the apple was gone, he placed the core gently on the ground near the roots, knowing that the soil here would take it back. He brushed his hands against his trousers and gathered the fold of his shirt again, feeling the round shapes of the fruit shift slightly as he adjusted his grip. There was no rush to leave, but he knew the walk back would be slower with his arms full. He stood a moment longer, letting his eyes rest on the tree. Its branches now touched with the first hints of dusk, its roots deep in the bank as if they had always been there and always would be. As he stepped toward the path, he felt the gentle tug of memory again, of his younger self walking this same way, perhaps with the same careful steps to keep from dropping what he carried. The land had changed in small ways over the years, but the path between the apple tree and home had always felt the same, and so he began the walk, each step accompanied by the soft sway of the apples in his shirt, their scent rising with the motion. The evening light wrapped itself around him, and the air seemed to grow still, as though the world itself were keeping pace. There would be time enough to reach the house. For now, the walk was as much a part of the day as the apples themselves. The air had shifted again by the time Samuel left the shade of the apple tree. It was no longer the bright warmth of afternoon, but the gentler cool that comes when the sun begins to slide behind the far ridge. The kind of cool that carries with it the promise of night, though the day still clings to the edges of the land in soft gold. The path home began at the curve of the creek, winding slowly back toward the pasture. He stepped onto it with care, the fold of his shirt cradling the apples against his chest. They shifted with each movement, a quiet reminder of the purpose of his walk, though in truth, there was no hurry to reach the kitchen table. The grass along the path was brushed with light, each blade tipped in amber where the sun still touched it. A dragonfly skimmed low over the creek beside him, its wings catching the last fragments of daylight before darting off toward the meadow. Samuel paused a moment to watch it vanish into the high grass, then continued on, his steps slow enough that he could hear the faint crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Here and there, the scent of the apples rose into the air, mingling with the cooler breath of the meadow. It was a scent that seemed to belong to this time of year alone, not quite the sharpness of early autumn, but something softer, gentler, with summer still lingering in its sweetness. The land around him felt as though it was settling into itself. The crickets had begun their evening chorus in earnest now, their steady rhythm weaving through the lower tones of the wind as it passed over the fields. From far off, maybe from the other side of the hill, came the faint bark of a dog, answered once and then not again. Samuel shifted the apples slightly in his arms, and not because they were heavy, but to feel their round, cool shapes against his palms. Each one was a small piece of the day he was carrying home, grown slowly, ripened under the same sky he walked beneath now, and gathered in the same quiet way his family had always done. The pasture opened ahead of him, a broad sweep of grass bordered by the familiar split-rail fence. Beyond it lay the old lane that led up to his house, but before crossing he stopped, letting his gaze travel across the field. The sun was low enough now that the shadows of the fence posts stretched long and straight across the ground, each one pointing toward the apple tree behind him. The memory of other evenings rose without asking, walking this same way with his father, the two of them speaking little, letting the sounds of the land fill the space between. Sometimes they would stop by the fence to rest their arms on the top rail and watch the last light fade from the grass. Other times they would walk straight through the gate, the scent of supper pulling them home. Tonight Samuel lingered. He let his eyes rest on the patterns of the grass, the way the breeze moved across it like water, bending it in gentle waves. The low sun caught on the seed, heads, making them glimmer as if the field had been dusted with some quiet gold. When he finally lifted the latch on the gate, it opened with the same soft groan he'd heard earlier in the day. the sound carried in the stillness, familiar and unchanging, like an old friend greeting him again. The lane beyond was lined with wild growth, blackberry brambles with a few late berries still clinging, their skin dark as the sky would soon be, tall stems of goldenrod leaning slightly toward the path, and here and there the delicate scatter of asters. Their petals were a pale lavender, nearly silver in the waning light, and they seemed to glow faintly in the deepening dusk. Samuel walked slowly, careful not to let the apples tumble from the fold of his shirt. The gravel beneath his boots shifted with a muted crunch, the sound carrying only a few feet before it was swallowed by the air. A squirrel darted across the lane ahead of him, its tail flicking once before it vanished into the hedge. The first cool fingers of evening touched the back of his neck, and he adjusted his hat slightly lower. Above the hedge, the sky was deepening from gold to a softer, dusty blue, and a single star had begun to show in the east. It was early yet for the full spread of stars, but that one light seemed to steady the horizon, as if reminding the land of the night to come. He thought about the apples he carried, how they would rest in a bowl on the kitchen table by lamplight, how tomorrow one might be sliced for breakfast, another baked into something warm. It was a simple enough future, but one that felt worth walking toward. The lane curved gently uphill, and from its crest, Samuel could see the outline of his house. The porch roof caught the last gleam of daylight, and a faint, warm glow shone from the kitchen window. The sight was as it had been for years, and yet each time it greeted him, he felt the same quiet assurance that this was where the day would end and where the next would begin. He slowed his steps even more, not from weariness, but from the wish to let this last part of the walk stretch a little longer. The air was rich with the mingled scents of earth and wood smoke from somewhere nearby. A robin called once from the hedge, its note clear and solitary, before falling silent. By the time he reached the porch gate, the apples had warmed slightly from his hands. He shifted them once more, careful as he lifted the latch. The hinges whispered and the gate swung open. The boards of the porch felt firm under his boots, the same as they had when he'd stepped down earlier. He paused there a moment, looking back down the lane, past the fence to the line of the meadow and the faint shimmer of the creek beyond. The apple tree was only a dark shape now, its details lost to the gathering dusk, but he could feel its presence as surely as if he were still standing beneath it. Only then did he step toward the door, the soft weight of the apples resting against him, carrying with them the scent of the tree, the sound of the creek, and the long, slow breath of the land in the turning of the day. The door opened with the same soft weight it always had, the hinges giving a low sigh as if glad to be moving again. Samuel stepped inside, careful not to let the apples roll free from the fold of his shirt. The air in the kitchen was warmer than the evening outside, touched with the faint scent of wood smoke from the stove and the clean smell of soap from the dishes drying on the rack. He moved slowly across the worn pine boards, each step sounding familiar underfoot, until he reached the table. It was a broad old table, the surface marked with years of use, faint rings from mugs of coffee set down in conversation, shallow scratches from knives and serving spoons, and the polished smoothness in the spots where hands had rested more often than anywhere else. Samuel set the apples down carefully, letting them roll a little until they found their place in a loose pile at the center. The colors deepened under the lamplight, the reds warmer, the greens softer, the yellows holding a quiet glow as if they had caught the last of the day's sunshine. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands resting on the edge of the table, looking at them as though they were more than fruit. They were the measure of an afternoon, the shape of a season, the gift of a tree that had been there longer than his own memory could stretch. He reached for the lamp on the counter and turned its knob until the flame brightened just enough to fill the corners of the room. The light lay gently on the shelves, the cupboards, the old enamel sink, and the jars lined neatly along the windowsill. Each jar held something from the garden: dried beans, herbs, the last of the summer's preserves, small stores of the year's work, waiting quietly for their turn. Samuel poured a glass of water from the pitcher and sat at the end of the table, letting the coolness of the glass rest against his palm before taking a sip. Outside the window, the light was fading into the deep blue of night, and the first stars had begun to show. He could see the faint outline of the barn against the sky, and beyond it, the dark suggestion of the meadow. Somewhere out there, the apple tree stood by the creek, already part of the night, its branches holding the quiet in place. The house felt still, but not empty. It carried the kind of stillness that comes when a space has been lived in for so long it has learned to keep company by itself. The faint tick of the clock on the wall marked the passing of time without hurry. Now and then the wood in the stove shifted with a soft crack, sending up a thread of heat that drifted into the room. Samuel reached for one of the apples and turned it in his hands. The skin was smooth beneath his fingertips, cool where it had been in the pile, faintly warm where the lamp's light touched it. He didn't bite into it yet, just held it, feeling the quiet weight of it, as though the whole afternoon were contained there. His eyes wandered to the cupboard, by the stove, where an old ceramic bowl sat waiting. He rose, placed the apples into it one by one, and set it in the middle of the table. The bowl had belonged to his mother, and the sight of it filled this simple act with memory. He could see her hands moving as she peeled apples in long, curling ribbons, her face bent in concentration, but softened by the hum of some tune she carried in her mind. He sat again, resting his elbows lightly on the table, and let his thoughts move between past and present. The rhythm of such evenings had not changed much over the years. There was always the coming in from the fields or the orchard, the putting down of whatever had been gathered, the small work of settling things into their place, and then the quiet, a quiet that made room for reflection without asking for it. Outside, the sound of the creek was faint but steady, reaching the kitchen in the pauses between the stove's soft crackle and the clock's patient ticking. The night air pressed gently against the window glass, and every so often a small draught carried in the scent of grass cooling under the stars. Samuel took another sip of water and leaned back, letting the chair's wooden slats support him. His shoulders eased in the warmth of the room, and the weight of the day began to loosen from his bones. It was not the weariness of hard labor, but the slow settling of a day well lived, the kind that invited rest without demanding it. He thought briefly about tomorrow, about the few tasks waiting for him: splitting some kindling, checking the fence by the north pasture, perhaps walking back to the tree to gather what apples might have fallen in the night. But those thoughts drifted quickly, as if the night itself had set them gently aside to be picked up later. In their place came the image of the apple tree under moonlight, its branches quiet and still, the creek moving beside it with the same low murmur it had kept for years. He imagined how the leaves would look in the silver light, how the roots would hold their place in the dark earth, and how the air around it would feel cooler, sharper, yet no less welcoming. He sat like that for a long time, not counting the minutes, only letting the stillness settle more deeply into the room. The apples in the bowl caught the lamplight, their rounded shapes casting soft shadows that touched and overlapped. The scent of them lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the warmth of the stove and the clean edge of the night drifting in from outside. Samuel felt no need to rise just yet. The night could take its time, and so could he. The day had given what it had to give: the walk, the tree, the creek, the gathering of small good things. And now it asked for nothing in return except to be remembered quietly. He let his gaze rest on the bowl of apples once more before closing his eyes, hearing in the back of his mind the soft, steady song of water over stone, and the faint rustle of leaves above a patch of shaded grass. Somewhere in that sound was the promise that tomorrow would come in its own time, carrying the same quiet grace. The night had settled in without fuss, as it always did in this part of the countryside. It came quietly, not with the rush of city lights blinking on or the hum of traffic shifting into a different rhythm, but with the gradual softening of the land, the darkening of the sky in slow layers. The last threads of gold had long since faded, replaced by a blue so deep it seemed to invite the stars forward. Samuel rose from the table. The weight of the day now eased into his bones in a comfortable way, and carried his glass to the sink. He rinsed it slowly, set it upside down on the drying rack, and wiped his hands on the cloth hanging from the cupboard door. The kitchen lamp cast a warm, honeyed light across the room, making the bowl of apples glow faintly in its circle of brightness. He let his eyes linger on them a moment longer, then turned toward the back door. The hinges gave a soft sigh as the door opened, and a cooler air wrapped around him. It carried the sense of night, damp earth, cut hay cooling in the fields, and a faint trace of wood smoke from somewhere farther down the valley. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards underfoot holding the day's warmth in a way that seemed almost reluctant to let it go. He took his place in the old rocking chair, the one that had belonged to his father before him. The arms of the chair had been worn smooth by decades of resting hands, the wood shaped subtly to fit the habit of sitting and thinking. He eased back into it, letting the creak of the runners match the slow rise and fall of his breath. From here, the view opened wide across the pasture and into the darker edge of the meadow. The apple tree was not visible from this angle, hidden beyond the slope and the creek, but Samuel knew exactly where it stood. He could picture it easily. A dark silhouette against the starlit sky, its leaves whispering in the same patient tone it had carried all afternoon. The stars had multiplied while he had been inside. They shone with that steady brightness you only see in places where the night is left untouched by artificial light. Some seemed sharp and clear like the points of pins, others glowed with a softer haze, as if they had been brushed into the sky. Overhead, the Milky Way stretched in a pale, luminous arc, a quiet river mirroring the one that ran through his land. Somewhere in the distance a barred owl called, a low, rounded sound that seemed to travel along the folds of the land. Samuel smiled faintly at the familiarity of it. The call was answered a few moments later, further off, and then the night folded back into its steady hum of crickets and the occasional rustle in the hedgerow. He reached for the mug of tea he'd brought out with him, its steam rising in thin, ghostly ribbons. The first sip was hot enough to make him pause, but the warmth spread quickly through his chest. The tea carried the faint bitterness of dried leaves, softened by honey from a neighbor's hive. A small sweetness that belonged to this very place, as much as the creek or the meadow. The rocking chair moved in a slow, even rhythm, the sound of its runners on the boards mingling with the night air. Samuel let his gaze drift across the pasture, noting the subtle shifts of shadow as the moon began its slow rise above the ridge. Its light pooled gently in the low places, silvering the edges of the grass and turning the gravel path to a pale ribbon leading home. He thought again of the apples on the table inside and of the tree that had given them. In some way, sitting here felt like keeping watch, not in the sense of guarding against harm, but in the way you sit with a friend, present and steady even when no words are spoken. The tree was out there, holding its place by the creek, and he was here, holding his place on the porch. Between them lay the land that had shaped his days. The tea cooled slowly in his hands as the night deepened. A light breeze moved across the porch, touching his face with the faintest chill. It carried with it the scent of the creek, clean, mineral, and tinged with the green of late summer leaves. He breathed it in and let it fill him, as though it might settle into the quiet spaces inside and stay there. Now and then a memory would drift forward, his father mending harness straps at this very porch, his mother humming softly as she shelled peas, the sound of cousins' laughter in the yard during long summer evenings. Each memory seemed to pass through him without urgency, settling for a moment before fading back into the larger stillness. The moon had climbed higher now, laying its light across the barn roof and the tops of the hedges. Samuel's eyes followed its slow progress, knowing it would eventually find the apple tree and silver its branches. He liked to think of the tree bathed in that light, the creek beside it glinting in answer, the whole scene unseen by anyone but still unfolding as it always had. He finished the last of his tea, set the mug on the porch rail, and let the rocking chair carry him a few moments longer. The night asked for nothing more than his presence, and he was content to give it. The cool air moved gently around him, the stars held their places, and somewhere beyond sight the apple tree kept company with the flowing water. When he finally rose, it was with the unhurried certainty that the night would still be here when he returned tomorrow, and the tree would still be waiting by the creek, holding in its roots the quiet history of the land. He stepped inside, leaving the door open just long enough to let the sound of crickets follow him into the warm light of the kitchen before the latch clicked softly shut. The kitchen still held its gentle warmth from the stove as Samuel stepped back inside. The lamplight lay soft over the bowl of apples, making them look as though they had been waiting for him all along. He touched the edge of the table in passing, the wood smooth under his fingertips, before turning toward the hallway that led to his bedroom. The house was quiet now, in the way that only an old house can be. Not silent, but filled with the small, steady sounds of settling. A board creaked somewhere in the corner of the room. The clock ticked its slow measure, and the faint sigh of the wind moved against the windows. He had lived with these sounds for so long that they felt less like noise and more like the house breathing alongside him. Samuel moved at an easy pace, letting the day release its last traces of weight from his shoulders. His boots made a muted thud against the hallway floor, and when he reached the bedroom door, he paused for a moment, hand resting on the frame. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the pale wash of moonlight slipping through the window. He stepped inside and began his slow evening ritual. The lamp on the bedside table gave a faint glow when he turned it up just enough to see by. He set his hat on the hook by the door, the crown shaped to his head after years of wear, and placed his folded shirt over the chair in the corner. The air here was cooler than in the kitchen, touched by the night through the open window. On the dresser sat a small pitcher and basin, relics from before the plumbing had reached this part of the county. Though he no longer needed them for their original purpose, he still used the basin to splash cool water over his face before bed. He did so now, the water catching a thin glimmer of lamplight as it left his hands. The freshness of it woke his skin in a quiet way, not to stir him toward the day, but to mark the last gentle act before rest. He crossed to the window, pushing it open a little wider. The air flowed in, carrying with it the scent of grass and the distant murmur of the creek. Somewhere far off, a whip-poor-will called into the darkness, its repeated notes falling into the rhythm of the night. Samuel rested his elbows on the sill, letting his eyes adjust to the world outside. From here, he could not see the apple tree, hidden as it was by the fold of land, but he knew the way the moonlight would be touching its leaves, silvering their edges. He imagined the creek beside it, dark but restless, turning the moon's reflection into ripples that would drift downstream. The thought brought with it a feeling of calm that was both deep and familiar, like the return of an old friend's voice. When the cool air began to make his skin prickle, he closed the window halfway and turned toward the bed. The quilt lay neatly folded at the foot, its patches of faded blues and greens reminding him of the fields in summer. He drew it up slowly after settling under the sheets, the weight of it pressing against him in a way that spoke of comfort rather than confinement. Lying there, Samuel let his mind wander back over the day, the walk through the pasture, the time beneath the tree, the careful gathering of apples. Each moment seemed to slow and settle, like silt drifting to the bottom of clear water. Nothing in the day had been urgent, yet each part of it felt necessary, as though it had filled some quiet space in him that might otherwise have been left empty. The sounds of the night came to him more clearly now, the steady ticking of the clock in the next room, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze, the almost imperceptible hum of insects in the grass beyond the house. They wove together into something like a lullaby, without melody or words, but with the same gentle effect. His eyes closed, opened once more, then drifted shut again. In the dark behind them, he saw the apple tree standing by the creek, its branches lifting and settling with the wind. He pictured the roots reaching deep into the bank, finding the same water they had drawn from for decades. There was something reassuring in that. The thought that while the world shifted in countless ways, some things simply stayed, holding their place quietly. Sleep began to move toward him then, not as a sudden pull, but as a slow tide. His breath fell into a deeper rhythm, matched by the rocking of the branches in his mind. The quilt's weight grew warmer, the air cooler, and the sound of the creek seemed to come closer, as though it had followed him here to keep him company through the night. The last thing he was aware of before sleep fully took him was the image of moonlight scattered on moving water, and the steady, patient presence of the old apple tree keeping watch by the creek. In that thought, there was nothing unfinished, nothing pressing, only the deep rest that comes when you know the land will hold your place until morning. The first light of morning did not rush into Samuel's room. It arrived the way a gentle hand rests on your shoulder, quietly, with no demand to wake before you're ready. It filtered through the thin curtains in long, pale bands, touching the quilt and the floorboards with the muted gold. The air in the room still held a trace of night's coolness, but somewhere, faintly, he could sense the warmth of the sun beginning its slow climb. He lay still for a few breaths, letting his eyes adjust, though they were already half open. The sounds of morning were softer than those of the night, yet no less familiar. The low murmur of the creek carrying through the open window, the first measured calls of birds in the hedge, and the distant clink of a pail from a neighbor's barn. These were not sounds that startled you awake. They eased you into the day the way the tide smooths its way onto the shore. Samuel sat up slowly, the quilt falling into gentle folds at his waist. The wood beneath his bare feet felt cool and solid, grounding him in the same way it had each morning for decades. He stayed seated on the edge of the bed for a moment, rubbing a hand across his face, not because he was reluctant to begin the day, but because there was no reason to hurry. The light through the curtains shifted slightly, brightening in one corner where the sun had cleared the line of the ridge. Dust motes floated in that pale beam, moving at their own unhurried pace. He found himself watching them for longer than he meant to, the way one might watch the drifting of clouds, small, ordinary, yet oddly complete in themselves. He dressed without rush, the soft worn shirt, the trousers that carried the faint scent of the outdoors, no matter how many times they were washed. The suspenders he had worn for so long, they felt like a part of his frame. His hands moved through each step with the memory of years, needing no thought to find the buttons or fold the cuffs. The kitchen was still in shadow when he stepped in, the lamp from last night turned down low, but not yet extinguished. The bowl of apples sat where he had left it, their skins catching just enough of the early light to glow faintly. He touched one as he passed, the way you might greet a friend without words. He filled the kettle at the sink, the water running cool over his fingers before he set it on the stove. The faint metallic rattle as it settled into place, the low whoosh of the flame. These were morning's opening notes. While the water heated, he stepped to the back door and opened it wide. The porch boards were damp with dew, darkened where the moisture had settled overnight. Beyond the steps, the pasture stretched away in a soft haze, the grass beaded with tiny drops that caught the sunlight in sudden flashes. The air carried the scent of wet earth and green things waking, a mixture that seemed to reach down into his chest and open it. A single cow lowed from somewhere up the valley, the sound deep and unhurried. Closer by, a robin hopped along the edge of the yard, pausing now and then to tip its head toward the ground, as if listening for something hidden beneath the soil. The kettle began its soft rumble inside, and Samuel stepped back in to pour the hot water over the waiting tea leaves. Steam rose in gentle swirls, carrying the green, almost grassy scent of the brew. He let it steep while he sliced a heel of bread and spread it with butter that softened instantly on contact. The simple meal was not much, but it felt as much a part of morning as the light or the air. Mug in hand, he returned to the porch and settled into the same rocking chair where he had sat the night before. The wood was cool now under his palms, the air fresh against his face. He took a slow sip of tea, the warmth of it spreading through him in the same way the day's first sunlight was spreading across the pasture. From here, he could see the faint shimmer of the creek through the lower trees, and though the apple tree itself was still hidden from view, he pictured it easily. He imagined the dew on its leaves, the weight of the night's coolness still in its bark, and the soft give of the moss beneath it. In his mind, it stood exactly as it had yesterday, and as it would tomorrow, a quiet anchor in the slow turning of the seasons. He thought briefly of walking there again after breakfast, not with any task in mind, but simply to see it in the morning light. There was a different quality to the creek at that hour, the water holding a paler reflection, the air filled with the sharper scents of mint and wild grass along its banks. But whether he went today or another day made little difference. The tree would be there, the creek would be there. The path between them would hold his footsteps whenever he chose to follow it. The sun climbed a little higher, drawing more color out of the world. The golds deepened in the grass, the greens brightened in the hedges, and the shadows along the fence posts shortened just enough to be noticed. Samuel rocked gently, the chair's quiet creak keeping time with his breath. The tea cooled in his hands, but he didn't mind. Morning here was not something to be rushed through towards something else. It was a thing to sit inside of, the way you might sit inside a memory, not clinging to it, but letting it move around you until it became part of your own quiet. And so he stayed, watching the light shift, listening to the steady hum of the land, feeling the day begin without the need to chase it. Somewhere beyond the meadow, the old apple tree waited by the creek, and in the soft certainty of that, Samuel found himself ready for whatever the hours might bring. The thought of the apple tree had stayed with Samuel through his first sips of tea, through the simple breakfast of bread and butter, and through the quiet rocking of the chair on the porch. It wasn't an urgent thought, not the kind that pressed for action. It was more like the slow nudge of an old friend's voice, gentle, patient, reminding him that a visit would be welcome whenever he was ready. By the time the mug was empty and the sun had risen enough to push its warmth across the yard, Samuel decided that the morning was meant for walking. He rose from the chair, the boards under his feet creaking softly, and stepped back into the kitchen to set the mug in the sink. The apples in the bowl seemed to catch the light as he passed, as if they, too, carried a quiet connection to the tree from which they'd come. The boots by the door were still dusted with yesterday's path, the faint outline of meadow grass pressed into the leather. He pulled them on without fuss, lacing them with the steady rhythm of someone who had done it nearly every day of his life. The door's latch clicked softly behind him, and he stepped into the clear brightness of the morning. The yard was washed in a freshness that only came at this hour. The dew clung to every blade of grass, and as he crossed toward the gate, the moisture darkened the leather of his boots. Each step brushed loose a small sparkle of water, scattering it into the air for a heartbeat before it fell again. The smell of the ground was rich, a blend of soil, damp leaves, and the faint sweetness of clover. The gate opened with its familiar groan, and Samuel stepped onto the path leading down toward the creek. The air shifted as he left the open yard and moved into the embrace of the pasture. Here, the grass grew a little taller, the breeze moved in longer strokes, and the sound of the water reached him more clearly. A few swallows traced arcs above him, their wings cutting through the stillness with quick, precise movements. He paused for a moment to watch them twist and turn against the pale sky, then continued on, letting his gaze settle on the gentle bend of the path ahead. The meadow was alive in a way that was not hurried. Bees moved from bloom to bloom in the low growth along the edges, their hum steady and untroubled. Grasshoppers leapt from his steps into the safety of taller stalks, their small movements barely disturbing the air. Somewhere close by, hidden in the green, a quail called, 3 short notes, repeated once, then silence again. As the path dipped toward the creek, the temperature dropped slightly, the shade of the overhanging trees mixing with the cool breath rising from the water. The air here carried the scent of wet stone and wild mint, sharper than the open meadow but no less welcome. The first glimpse of the apple tree's crown appeared over the rise, leaves catching the sun in flashes between the branches. Samuel slowed, letting the moment stretch, each step bringing more of the tree into view until he could see it fully, standing in its place as it had for so many years. The morning light gave it a different kind of beauty than the afternoon had. The sun, still low enough to angle in from the east, lit the underside of the leaves and turned them into small lanterns of green. The fruit that hung low in the branches carried a faint sheen of dew, each drop holding a fragment of the sky. He stepped off the path and into the soft grass beneath the tree's shade. The ground here was springy with moss, cool underfoot even through his boots. The sound of the creek was close now, its voice a steady murmur against the stones with the occasional brighter note when the water slipped over a shallow. Samuel rested a hand against the trunk, feeling the rough texture of the bark under his palm. It was warm on one side from the sun, cooler on the other where the shade lingered. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing in the mingled scents of water, earth, and apple. He walked slowly around the tree, noting how the light touched it from different angles. Here a branch framed against the clear blue sky, there a cluster of fruit half hidden in shadow. Each view felt like a reminder that even something you've known all your life can still show you a new face if you take the time to see it. A single apple had fallen near the bank, resting in the grass at the edge where it met the stone. He picked it up, feeling its coolness from the dew still clinging to its skin. For a moment he considered taking it back to the house, but instead he set it gently on the moss near the roots, leaving it for the small creatures that would find it before the day was done. He lowered himself to sit on the same patch of grass where he had rested the day before. The light moved gently across the creek, turning the ripples into a shifting pattern of silver and shadow. Across the water, a kingfisher darted from a branch, skimming low before landing again further downstream. Its brief cry echoed once, then was gone. Samuel leaned back against the trunk, letting his eyes half close. The sounds of the morning wrapped around him, the creek's endless conversation, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the meadow above. The coolness of the shade balanced the warmth of the sun touching his legs where the light reached past the branches. Time here was not measured in minutes. It was measured in the way the breeze shifted direction, in the changing angle of the sun, in the slow dance of shadows over the grass. And as he sat, Samuel felt himself ease into that rhythm, letting the world move at its own pace without asking anything of him. The apple tree stood as it always had, and the creek moved beside it, and he, for this morning, for this hour, was part of that same steady flow. There would be the walk back home, the work of the day, the return of evening. But for now, there was only the quiet company of the land, the soft pull of the sun, and the deep, patient presence of the tree by the creek. Samuel lingered a while longer beneath the apple tree, feeling the way its presence seemed to press gently against him, not in weight, but in familiarity. It was the kind of company that asked for nothing, the kind you could leave and return to without explanation. Eventually, though, the sounds of the creek drew him outward. He rose slowly, brushing the bits of moss from his trousers, and stepped toward the bank. The grass here was soft and bent under his weight, damp in places where the dew had not yet given way to the sun. The edge of the creek curved away from the tree like a ribbon unwinding, its surface flashing now and then when the breeze caught it just right. The water moved with that unhurried constancy he had known all his life. It never seemed to rush, yet it was always on its way somewhere, slipping over stones, curling around small islands of gravel, disappearing around bends where the banks grew taller. Samuel took a slow breath and began to follow it downstream, his steps careful along the uneven edge. Here and there, the roots of other trees reached out toward the water, clutching at the soil in thick, twisting shapes. Some were gnarled and bare, worn smooth in places by years of rain and current. Between them, small ferns had taken root, their fronds lifting delicately in the moving air. He bent slightly to touch one, the cool dampness of it clinging briefly to his fingertips before springing back into place. The bank narrowed where the creek cut closer to the rise of the meadow. Samuel stepped onto a patch of flat stone, worn into shallow depressions that still held a thin film of water from the night's condensation. The stone was cool through the soles of his boots, and as he stood there, he could see minnows darting in the shallows below, their small silver bodies flashing like slivers of light. A kingfisher's cry broke the morning softness for a moment, sharp but not unwelcome. Samuel looked up just in time to see the bird launch from a low branch and skim across the water before disappearing around the bend. The ripples from its passing spread outward in widening rings, each one smaller and softer until they vanished back into the creek's natural rhythm. He stepped off the stone and continued along the bank. The path here wasn't marked in any clear way, just a suggestion of flattened grass where deer or raccoon had passed before. Every so often he saw their tracks in the damp earth, the small paired prints of hooves, the delicate impressions of paws. These signs felt less like intrusions and more like proof of the shared life along the water. A patch of wild mint grew near the base of a leaning willow, its scent rising sharply when his boot brushed against it. He stooped to rub a leaf between his fingers, holding it to his face for a moment before letting it fall back into place. The freshness of it mixed with the deeper smell of wet soil, creating something that felt like the very essence of this place, bright and grounding at the same time. Where the bank widened again, a fallen branch had settled across the water, wedged between two rocks. Moss had begun to creep along its length, and the steady drip of water from its underside tapped a gentle rhythm into the pool below. Samuel stopped there, watching the surface swirl lazily around it, imagining how long it had been here. Maybe a season, maybe longer, and how the creek would, in its own time, carry it away. The sun had risen enough now to send its light slanting through the gaps in the trees, laying long, narrow pools of gold across the water. In those patches of light, he could see the pebbles on the creek bed, smooth, rounded, and in colors that only seemed to reveal themselves under the moving water. Some were the pale beige of old bone, others the deep red-brown of clay. Still others veined faintly with lines of quartz. A heron stood farther downstream, still as a carving, its long neck drawn in and its gaze fixed on the shallows. Samuel slowed his pace so as not to disturb it. He admired the patience of such a bird, how it could remain motionless for minutes at a time, waiting for the right moment, trusting the water to bring it what it needed. When the heron finally moved, it did so with a grace that seemed almost unreal, lifting from the bank in a slow arc before disappearing over the treetops. The creek curved again, leading him to a small gravel bar that jutted into the flow. Samuel stepped onto it, hearing the crunch of stones under his boots. From here, the view opened, the water on one side, the meadow rising on the other, and behind him, the apple tree just visible through the leaves. He stood with his hands resting loosely at his sides, letting the moment settle around him. There was no destination to reach, no task waiting at the end of this walk. The act of following the creek was enough. Each turn of the water revealed something small. A drift of leaves caught in an eddy, the glint of a fish just below the surface, the shadow of a branch swaying across the current. These were the kinds of details that couldn't be gathered in a hurry. They had to be given to you in their own time. After a while, Samuel turned back, retracing his steps along the bank. The sounds came to him in layers now. The steady voice of the creek, the rustle of the meadow grass in the breeze, the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the light wind. He felt as though he carried them with him, tucked into the same quiet space where the memory of the apple tree lived. By the time he stepped back into its shade, the sun had climbed higher, scattering the last beads of dew from the leaves overhead. He rested a hand once more on the trunk, the bark warm now under his palm, and let a long breath pass between him and the tree. Then, with the same easy pace that had carried him here, he began the walk back toward the meadow, the creek's murmur following him like a familiar song. Samuel left the shade of the apple tree with no real intention of hurrying home. The morning was too fine for that. It was the kind of day that seemed to stretch out its hands to you, offering more hours than you expected and asking only that you spend them gently. Instead of taking the narrow path that followed the fence line straight back toward the house, he turned toward the open sweep of the meadow. This way was longer, but it let him walk through the broad belly of the land, where the grass grew tall enough to brush against his legs and the air seemed wider somehow. The sun was high enough now to warm the crown of his hat, but not so high that it pressed heat into the back of his neck. The light had a different character here in the meadow, more open, less filtered, pouring down in a way that made every blade of grass seem sharper in its outline. Dew still clung to the lower stems, though the drops had shrunk to fine beads, catching the light like tiny glass orbs before breaking and sliding into the soil. A chorus of crickets worked steadily in the undergrowth, their rhythm joined now and then by the quick whir of grasshoppers launching themselves from his steps. The grass parted ahead of him with each movement, then closed behind, erasing the path as quickly as it had opened. It was an old meadow, one that had known years of mowing and years left wild, its soil dark and rich from the patient work of roots and rain. To his left, a pair of gold finches dipped in and out of the thistles, their yellow feathers catching the sun so brightly they seemed lit from within. They moved together as if tied by an invisible string, one rising just as the other descended, their high, sweet calls falling into the open air between them. Samuel slowed to watch them for a few moments, letting the grass sway around him, the stems brushing softly against the backs of his hands. A narrow stream, little more than a shallow runoff from the creek, cut across his way. Its bed was lined with flat stones, and the water over them was clear enough to see each shape distinctly. He crouched to touch the surface, feeling its coolness cling briefly to his skin before running away between his fingers. A single water strider balanced there, its long legs dimpling the surface without breaking it, riding the tiny current as easily as if it were still. Rising again, Samuel continued toward a small rise in the land. From its crest he could see the lay of the meadow in full, the slow roll of it toward the distant fence, the darker line of the hedgerow marking the far edge, and beyond that, the faint shimmer of the road winding out of sight. But it wasn't the distance that held him there. It was the way the wind moved over the grass in long, unbroken strokes, bending it in patterns that shifted and mended themselves without a sound. He stayed still until the breeze eased, then began his descent, letting his boots find the natural hollows between the clumps of growth. A rabbit darted from a patch of clover just ahead, its white tail flashing once before it disappeared into the shadow of a fallen log. The log itself was half hidden by the grass, its bark long gone, the pale wood beneath furrowed with age and softened by moss. As he passed, Samuel rested a hand lightly on its surface, the texture cool and faintly damp. He thought of how many seasons it had lain here, slowly returning to the soil, feeding the same meadow it had once stood over. There was a kind of quiet rightness in that, a return without ceremony, as much a part of the cycle as the rising of the grass each spring. The slope leveled into a broad stretch where the grass was shorter, the work of deer or perhaps the neighbor's cattle in past months. Here, the wind seemed freer, unbroken by the taller stems, and it carried with it the faintest scent of the barn at home. Dry hay, wood, and the memory of warm afternoons. That scent reached into him in a way that was both grounding and light, pulling threads of memory without tangling them. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, the sound clear and high, tracing a line across the sky that he followed with his eyes until the bird itself was a speck, and then nothing at all. When he looked back to the meadow, he noticed the way the shadows had shifted, shorter now and leaning in a different direction. Time was moving, but here it felt less like a river, and more like the slow swing of a gate in the breeze. Steady, unforced. He found himself nearing the far fence sooner than expected, the weathered rails leaning slightly where the ground had softened over the years. Beyond it, the yard opened toward the house, its roof just visible over the rise. The sight was welcome, not because he was eager to be indoors, but because it meant the walk had carried him in a full, quiet circle, from home to tree, from creek to meadow, and now back again. Before crossing the fence, Samuel turned once more to look over the meadow. The wind had risen again, combing its way across the field until the grass shone in shifting bands of light and shadow. It seemed to him that this view was worth carrying, a kind of picture that stayed behind the eyes, ready to be called upon in quieter moments. He stepped over the lowest rail and into the yard, the grass here shorter and dotted with the small white faces of clover. The house stood in its place as it had every morning of his life, the porch catching the sun in its boards, the windows reflecting the soft blue of the sky. By the time he reached the back steps, the air had warmed just enough to soften the coolness in his boots. He paused there for a moment, resting a hand on the porch post, and let the breeze pass once more across his face. It carried with it the sense of the meadow and the creek, still clinging faintly to him, as if they had followed him home. Inside, the kitchen would still hold the quiet of the morning he had left behind, and the apples would be waiting in their bowl. But for now, he stayed where he was, between the meadow and the door, letting the slow, steady pulse of the land sink deeper into him before stepping back into the life of the house. Samuel stepped inside with the quiet sense that the house had been waiting for him. It wasn't that anything had changed since he left. The kitchen was just as he'd left it that morning, the bowl of apples in its place, the air holding the faint scent of wood smoke from the stove. But there was something about returning from the meadow and the creek that made the walls feel warmer, as if they had drawn in some of the sunlight he'd walked through. He set his hat on the peg by the door and loosened the laces of his boots, sliding them off so as not to track in the fine dust from the yard. His socks found the coolness of the floorboards, and he stood there for a moment, letting his feet adjust to the change. The shift from the meadow's soft, uneven ground to the steady flatness of the kitchen felt like stepping into a different rhythm, slower, more contained, but still gentle. The apples caught his eye again, their skins glinting faintly in the angled light from the window. The sun had risen far enough now to pour a beam directly across the table, laying its gold over the bowl and making the reds deeper, the greens softer. He walked over and ran his hand lightly over them, feeling the cool smoothness of each one under his palm. It had been a long while since he'd baked anything more than bread, but the thought of a pie came to him easily now, not as a chore, but as a way to keep the morning with him a little longer. His mother's old pie tin sat in the cupboard, its edges worn smooth from years of use. He could almost hear the faint rattle it made when she set it down on the counter, the sound a kind of prelude to the scent that would follow. Samuel moved without hurry, the way a man does when the work ahead is familiar enough to do by feel. He filled the basin at the sink and set it on the counter, rinsing the apples one by one, their skins shining more brightly as the water slid over them. Each one gave off its own faint fragrance when he cut into it, a mixture of tartness and sweetness that rose into the air and seemed to make the room itself breathe a little deeper. The paring knife moved slowly in his hand, peeling the skin in long, curling ribbons. Some fell neatly into the bowl beside him, others slipped over the edge and landed on the counter, their spirals catching the light before settling. He sliced the apples into even wedges, each piece falling with a soft sound against the pile. The repetition was its own kind of calm. Cut, turn, place, cut, turn, place, until the bowl was full and the cutting board smelled richly of fresh fruit. From the pantry, he brought out the flour tin and the crock of butter. The flour sifted into the mixing bowl like fine snow, dusting the air for a moment before settling. The butter was cool under his fingers as he cut it into the flour, the pieces breaking down slowly under the pressure of the pastry cutter. The smell of it, faintly sweet, faintly nutty, reminded him of mornings in his mother's kitchen when she would hum to herself without realizing she was doing it. He added just enough water to bring the dough together, the mixture turning smooth under his hands as he worked it into a single ball. There was no rush to roll it out. He let it rest a moment under a clean cloth while he measured sugar and cinnamon into a small jar. When he opened the spice tin, the warm, sharp scent of cinnamon rose immediately, bringing with it a rush of memory. Autumn afternoons when the air outside was sharp and the windows inside were fogged with steam from the oven. The dough rolled out in slow, even passes, the pen pressing it thin but steady. He laid it into the pie tin and tipped in the apples, sprinkling the sugar and cinnamon between the layers. The scent deepened as it met the fruit, and he paused for a moment just to take it in. The top crust went on last, its edges pressed down with the tines of a fork. The small vent in the center cut in the same simple shape his mother had always used. A single cross, nothing fancy, just enough to let the steam escape. He slid the pie into the oven and shut the door gently, the iron latch catching with a sound that was both solid and soft. The heat filled the kitchen slowly, carrying with it the scent of baking apples and melting sugar. Samuel leaned against the counter, letting the warmth reach his hands, his arms, his face. The clock ticked in the quiet, and the only other sound was the faint hiss from the stove as the pie baked. Outside the window, a breeze stirred the leaves of the maple in the yard, their shadows shifting lazily across the wall. He thought of the apple tree again, how its branches must be swaying in the same air, the fruit that remained hanging easily until their time came. When the crust began to turn the color of late summer hay, he took the pie out and set it on the rack to cool. The smell was full and rich now, filling the room so completely that it seemed to press lightly against the walls. He placed a clean cloth over it to keep in the warmth, though he knew it would be hours before he cut into it. Some things were better when they had been given time to rest. He poured himself another cup of tea and sat at the table, the pie just within reach, the sunlight falling over it in a way that made the crust glow faintly. There was no need to do anything else just yet. The house was quiet, the land outside was steady, and here at the table, with the scent of apples rising into the air, Samuel felt the kind of peace that didn't need to be named. The afternoon sunlight had softened by the time Samuel thought to cut the pie. It had cooled on the counter for several hours, the crust settling into itself, the scent deepening into something warm and steady. Outside, the air carried that gentle stillness particular to mid-afternoon, when the breeze has quieted and the day pauses for a while before tilting toward evening. He took a clean plate from the cupboard and cut a slice slowly, the crust giving way with a quiet crackle under the knife. The filling held together just enough, the apples glistening faintly as they slid onto the plate. The smell that rose was almost more than the taste itself, sweet, familiar, touched with cinnamon and that hint of tartness that kept it from being too rich. With the slice in one hand and a fork in the other, Samuel walked to the back door. The hinges gave their usual soft groan, and he stepped out onto the porch where the boards had been warming all day under the sun. He set the plate on the small table beside his chair and lowered himself into the seat, letting the wood take his weight the way it had for years. From here, the view opened wide across the yard and into the meadow beyond. The fence line made a quiet frame for the distance, its rails silvered by weather and softened at the edges. The grass out there swayed only now and then, touched by the faintest breath of wind. Samuel took his first bite without hurry, letting the fork rest in his hand a moment before lifting it. The crust was tender, the apples yielding and warm against his tongue, and for a moment it was as if the kitchen, the tree, and the creek were all here with him in that single taste. He chewed slowly, not because the pie demanded it, but because it seemed wrong to rush something that had taken so many hours and so many years of growing to arrive here. The porch itself had its own company. A pair of swallows darted in and out from under the eaves, their small shadows crossing the boards near his feet. Somewhere in the yard, a chicken clucked softly to itself, scratching at the dry earth for whatever it might find. From the maple near the fence came the occasional flutter of leaves, each one catching the light differently as it turned. He rested the fork on the plate and leaned back, the chair creaking in the same slow rhythm it always had. The scent of the pie mingled with the air, warm, spice carrying just far enough to reach the porch steps before the breeze lifted it away. Samuel's eyes followed a cloud drifting across the pale blue sky its shape shifting almost imperceptibly as it moved. He had spent years watching clouds from this porch, though he couldn't remember ever setting out to do so. They simply came into view as he sat here, and he let them pass in their own time. Between bites, he let his gaze wander to the edge of the yard, where the apple tree's topmost leaves showed above the rise. He couldn't see the trunk from here, but he knew its place exactly. It was the same whether he stood beside it or thought of it from across the field. Constant, unhurried, a kind of anchor in the shifting seasons. The sun shifted lower, its light slipping under the porch roof to touch the tops of his boots. The warmth there was steady, not sharp, the kind that seeps into the leather and lingers. Samuel set the empty plate aside and folded his hands loosely in his lap. Somewhere down the road, a wagon passed, the sound of its wheels on the gravel carrying faintly through the open air. It faded as it moved away, replaced again by the quieter sounds of the yard. The chicken's occasional call, the dry click of a grasshopper landing on the step, the almost inaudible hum of bees working in the clover. The afternoon settled into that gentle balance where nothing seemed to be beginning or ending. Samuel felt it in his shoulders, in the way his breathing slowed, in the ease that came from sitting still without the weight of unfinished tasks pressing against him. The pie, the porch, the view, they seemed not separate but part of the same whole, each holding its place without effort. A shadow from the maple crept slowly across the table beside him, and when it reached the edge, he rose, carrying his plate back inside. The kitchen was cooler now, the light in it softer, and the scent of apples still lingered, though fainter than before. He set the plate in the sink but didn't wash it just yet. There would be time enough for that later, after the day had made its slow turn toward evening. For now, he poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter and returned to the porch, settling once more into the chair. The sky was beginning to take on the faintest hint of gold at its edges, and Samuel knew the rest of the day would be no more hurried than this. In the quiet, he let his eyes rest on the line of trees beyond the meadow, their forms beginning to darken against the light. The apple tree was out there still, the creek beside it moving in its own steady way, and the thought of both was enough to carry him easily into whatever the evening would bring. By the time Samuel rose from his chair again, the sun had lowered itself to a point where the light lay long and slanted across the yard. The afternoon's warmth had loosened into something gentler, and the air carried that faint coolness that told him night was not far behind. He stood at the porch rail for a moment, letting his eyes wander over the distance, then stepped down slowly, his boots pressing into the grass with a muted sound. There was no rush in his movement, no destination that could not wait, yet his feet seemed to choose the direction without asking, toward the rise at the edge of the yard, and beyond it toward the old apple tree by the creek. It was the same path he had walked countless times before, in all manner of light, but there was something in the dusk that made it feel almost like a different road entirely. The sky above was shifting even as he walked. In the west, the sun's edge glowed in a softened gold, while toward the east, the first hints of evening's blue began to settle. Overhead, the clouds had thinned into pale ribbons, their edges catching the light so that they looked almost translucent. The air was quieter now, the daytime calls of birds giving way to the slower, deeper tones of the evening chorus. Somewhere in the hedge, a mourning dove sounded its low, unhurried call, the kind that seemed to carry further when the world was still. The grass under his boots was cool where the shadow had already fallen, but on the open slope, it still held a bit of the day's warmth. He noticed how each step through it left a faint, dark imprint that faded back into the green within moments, as if the earth itself were unwilling to keep the mark for long. As he reached the rise, the meadow beyond came into view, its colors subdued now, the greens deepening, the seed heads of the taller grasses catching the last strands of light. He paused there, letting his eyes travel to where the creek cut its line through the land, and just beyond it, the apple tree stood in its steady place. The walk across the meadow took him longer than it had in the morning, though he hadn't intended it that way. The cooler air seemed to slow him, and the sounds of the evening, the rustle of a rabbit slipping into cover, the faint splash from the creek, invited him to linger. He stopped once to watch a pair of bats circle overhead, their movements quick and silent against the dimming sky. When he reached the far edge, the ground dropped slightly toward the creek, and there the air grew cooler still. The water's surface reflected the last of the day's color, a pale orange near the bank, fading into the deeper blue of the main channel. Samuel stepped down to the place where the grass gave way to smooth stones, and from there he could hear the steady murmur of the current more clearly. The apple tree's branches stretched overhead, their leaves shifting gently in the breeze that came along the water. In this light, the fruit still hanging looked almost like shadows, their colors muted but their shapes clear. He reached up and let his hand rest briefly against one of the lower limbs, the bark rough under his palm, cool from the evening air. There is no need to pick anything now. The pie at home would last him for days, and the rest of the apples could stay here until the time felt right. Instead, he lowered himself onto the grass at the base of the trunk, leaning back against it in the way he had since boyhood. From here, the creek ran at an angle across his sight, its surface broken here and there by small ripples where a fish rose or a twig drifted. The light continued to fade, and with the sounds changed again. The crickets began their steady rhythm, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and from far down the bank came the low croak of a frog settling into its night place. Above, the first star pricked through the deepening blue, and Samuel found himself watching for the next one, then the next, until the sky held more points of light than he could count without losing track. It was easy to stay here, to let the coolness settle into his shoulders, and the quiet work its way through him. He thought of the path back to the house, the porch light that would be glowing by the time he returned, and the warmth that would meet him when he stepped inside. But for now, there was no call to leave. The apple tree seemed to share that stillness with him. The way it rooted itself without strain, the way its branches moved only as much as the air asked them to. He breathed with it for a while, his eyes half closed, the murmur of the creek filling the spaces between thoughts. When at last he rose, the sky was well on its way to night, the stars clear and steady. He touched the trunk once more before turning back across the meadow. The grass brushed against his boots as he walked, and the cool air followed him, carrying the faint scent of water and leaves all the way to the rise. From there, he could see the porch light in the distance, a small, steady glow against the dark. It seemed to him then that the house, the meadow, the creek, and the apple tree were all part of the same quiet circle, each holding its place, each keeping watch in its own way, so that nothing felt lost as the day came gently to its close. By the time Samuel crested the gentle rise toward the yard, night had settled into its full, unhurried shape. The last of the sunset's color was fading in the west, a narrow band of soft gold giving way to the deep blue of evening. Overhead, the stars had gathered in quiet clusters, their light sharp yet somehow gentle, as though they understood the need for stillness here. The porch light glowed ahead, not bright enough to reach far, but steady enough to guide him home. Its small circle of warmth touched the top steps and spilled a faint glimmer over the boards, making the wood look as though it had been polished by years of hands and feet passing over it. Samuel's boots made a muted sound in the grass as he crossed the yard, the coolness of the blades brushing against his ankles. The air carried with it the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the hill, perhaps a neighbor tending a fire to keep the night's chill at bay. The thought of it blended easily with the warmth waiting for him inside, the way memories sometimes fold themselves into the present without asking. When he reached the steps, he paused with one hand on the porch rail. The wood there was smooth from use, and he could feel the faint coolness it had drawn from the night air. From this vantage, he could see only the topmost edge of the apple tree in the distance, a darker shape against the darker sky. The creek beside it would be moving unseen now, its voice carrying faintly in the stillness, not loud enough to be heard clearly from here, but present in the way one can sense the movement of water without seeing it. He stepped up onto the porch, the boards giving their familiar creak under his weight. The porch light hummed softly and a small moth circled it in slow, unsteady loops. For a moment, Samuel stood there watching, the tiny creature's pale wings catching the glow each time it passed through the beam. There was a kind of comfort in its persistence, the way it kept returning to the light, untroubled by the darkness beyond. Inside, the house welcomed him with its familiar scents, the lingering trace of apples from the pie, the faint resin of the wood stove even though it had gone cold, the clean linen smell from the freshly aired quilt in the bedroom. He closed the door behind him, the latch catching with its soft click, and set his hat on its peg. The quiet that followed was deep enough to seem like part of the walls themselves. Samuel crossed to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. The water was cool, carrying the faint taste of the well, a taste that for him meant home in a way no other could. He drank it slowly, feeling the day settle in his bones as the last traces of the walk eased from his legs. In the lamplight, the kitchen felt both alive and at rest. The pie sat under its cloth on the counter, as though it too were waiting for the night to pass before offering itself again. Samuel touched the edge of the cloth lightly, then left it in place. He carried his glass back to the porch and settled into the chair he had left earlier. The night air was cooler now, but the stillness held its own kind of warmth. From somewhere down the road came the faint sound of a nightjar's call, followed by a long pause in which the land seemed to listen. Leaning back, he let his gaze move between the yard and the sky. The stars above seemed closer here than they did in town, their arrangement familiar yet never exactly the same. He traced the line of one constellation, then lost it to the shifting of his eyes, only to find another in its place. The porch boards under his boots gave off a faint scent of sun-warmed pine, even now in the dark. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, the grain of the wood smooth under his fingers. Every so often a light breeze passed through, carrying with it the scent of the creek and the meadow grass beyond. Samuel thought briefly of the apple tree, how it stood now in the quiet, branches lifted into the dark, holding both the fruit that remained and the emptiness where others had been taken. The thought did not bring sadness, but rather a kind of reassurance. The tree's work went on, season by season, without need for hurry or fear. The glass in his hand grew cooler as the water inside settled to the night air's temperature. He took one last sip, set it on the table beside him, and folded his hands in his lap. His breathing slowed, matching the gentle rhythm of the night around him. In time, the weight of the day, not heavy but full, began to ease him toward rest. He rose from the chair and stepped inside, switching off the porch light before closing the door. The kitchen was dim now, the lamplight reduced to a faint glow that reached just far enough to guide his way. As he moved toward the bedroom, Samuel felt the same quiet certainty he always did at the end of such days, that the land outside would keep its watch, that the apple tree would stand where it always had, and that the creek's steady voice would carry through the dark until morning returned. The latch clicked softly behind him as he closed the bedroom door, and the house settled once more into its deep, familiar silence. The kind that holds you, not apart from the world, but gently within it. Samuel woke before the sun had fully risen, in that tender space between night and day when the air still held the cool weight of darkness, yet the promise of light had already begun to stir. The house around him was quiet, though not silent, the kind of quiet that holds small sounds at its edges, the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen, the soft shift of wood as it breathed with the coolness of dawn. He lay still for a while, his eyes adjusting to the pale, silvered light filtering through the curtains. It was a light without sharpness, the sort that filled the room evenly, touching the worn floorboards, the edges of the quilt, the curve of the chair in the corner. Samuel breathed deeply, drawing in the faint scents that the night had carried in. The dampness of the meadow, the cool tang of the creek, the distant sweetness of grass just beginning to warm again. When he rose, his steps were unhurried. The floor under his feet felt cool through his socks, and the air had that slight bracing edge that made him think of mornings from his boyhood. Mornings when he would step outside to find the grass silvered with dew, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath before the first true warmth of the sun arrived. He pulled on his shirt and moved to the window, pushing it open a little wider. The breeze that entered was soft and steady, carrying the layered scents of water, earth, and the faint apple fragrance drifting up from the tree down by the creek. His eyes followed the slow lifting of the mist in the distance, a veil that curled and thinned above the meadow, catching the light in ways that made the familiar landscape look briefly new again. In the kitchen, the morning light had begun to gather along the edges of the table, turning the grain of the wood to gold. Samuel poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher, letting it wake him gently before the day began. The water tasted faintly of stone and spring, cool, clear, and without hurry. He stepped onto the porch with the cup still in hand. The boards under his feet felt faintly damp, having taken in the night's cool air. The yard lay quiet before him, the grass bending under beads of dew that caught the first hints of sunlight. Beyond the fence, the meadow was a patchwork of shadow and light, the higher grasses leaning with the faintest movement of wind. The apple tree was visible now in its full shape, no longer just a silhouette against the sky. Its branches were still in the morning calm, the leaves holding small drops of water that glimmered when they caught the rising light. Even from here, Samuel thought he could sense the steadiness of it, the way it had stood through so many mornings like this, each one both the same and entirely its own. He took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness rest in his mouth before swallowing. The air was so still that he could hear the creek more clearly than he had the night before. It made a sound that was not quite a song, yet had its own gentle rhythm, a sound that seemed to hold time differently, as though each moment lingered longer there. The first bird calls began, tentative at first and then more sure. A sparrow's quick, light notes came from the fence post, followed by the richer, longer call of a thrush from somewhere deeper in the trees. Their voices overlapped without crowding one another, each keeping its own pace. Samuel set his cup down on the porch rail and leaned his hands on either side of it, feeling the smoothness worn into the wood. His gaze drifted again toward the apple tree. He thought of walking there before the sun rose higher, when the grass still held its cool dampness and the mist had not yet fully lifted from the low ground near the creek. So he stepped down from the porch and began across the yard, his boots darkening in patches as the dew clung to the leather. The air carried a freshness that seemed to belong only to these early hours, clean, almost weightless, yet filled with the subtle scents of the land. Each step brought the apple tree nearer, its form slowly filling more of his view until he could see the rough pattern of bark along the trunk. When he reached it, Samuel paused in the same way he always did, as though greeting an old friend. He laid his palm against the bark, feeling the coolness of it through his skin. Above him, a few drops of dew fell from the higher leaves, catching the light as they fell to the grass. The creek beside him moved steadily, its surface marked by the occasional widening ripple where an insect landed or a fish brushed the surface from below. The mist here was thicker, curling above the water in slow, unbroken streams. Samuel lowered himself to sit at the base of the tree, leaning his back against the trunk. The dampness of the grass came through the fabric of his trousers, but it was not unpleasant. It was simply another piece of the morning, another reminder of the land's presence. From where he sat, he could see the sun's first full edge rise above the far ridge, its light spilling slowly into the meadow. The mist caught it and turned it into shifting bands of gold and pale white, and the air itself seemed to warm almost imperceptibly. He watched the change without counting the minutes, letting the day arrive as it wished. In that moment, Samuel felt the same quiet assurance he had known on countless mornings, that this place and the life he lived within it needed nothing added to make it whole. The apple tree, the creek, the meadow, the slow light of the sun, they held their own completeness, and in their presence, so did he. Samuel remained seated at the base of the apple tree for a while, letting the light continue to grow around him. The warmth from the rising sun spread slowly, like water seeping into dry soil, and the shift in temperature seemed to wake the meadow in its own quiet way. The low hum of insects began to join the bird's song, a thread of sound that wove itself into the morning without disturbing it. The creek's voice was steady beside him, the kind of sound that asked nothing of the listener but offered a presence nonetheless. Samuel had always found it difficult to say where that comfort came from, whether it was the water's rhythm or its way of shaping the air with its coolness, or perhaps the simple fact that it had been here long before him and would remain long after. After a time, he pushed himself up from the grass, brushing away the faint dampness that clung to the back of his trousers. The idea of following the creek's path came to him without urgency, like a suggestion offered by the land itself. There was no destination in mind, only the slow, meandering walk that followed the water wherever it led. The bank here was soft underfoot, the earth dark and rich from years of fallen leaves and rain. In some places, the grass gave way to patches of moss, bright and thick, that seemed to hold the morning's moisture in their spongy surface. Samuel stepped carefully where the ground sloped toward the water, his boots sinking slightly but holding firm. Above the creek, the branches of willows and young maples reached out, their leaves trembling faintly in the breeze. Sunlight slipped through the shifting canopy, falling in scattered shapes on the water. These patches of light moved slowly downstream, breaking apart and reforming as the current carried them forward. Every so often, Samuel stopped, not because the walk demanded it, but because there was something worth noticing. Once, it was the flash of a trout in the clear shallows, its body twisting with an ease that seemed made for this narrow ribbon of water. Another times, it was the sight of a spider's web strung between two reeds, its threads jeweled with dew that caught the morning light. He walked as one might read a familiar book, pausing at certain passages not to understand them better, but simply to let their meaning linger. The creekside path was narrow in places, opening wider in others, and Samuel let its curves set his pace. In a small clearing, where the grass grew taller and the ground leveled out, he came upon an old fence post, its wood silvered and split from years of weather. Only 2 rusted strands of wire remained attached, the rest long since fallen away. It stood as a quiet marker of what the land had once been, a line drawn for reasons that no longer mattered, yet left to stand all the same. Beyond the post, the creek bent sharply, and Samuel followed it to where the water deepened into a still pool. Here, the surface reflected the sky almost perfectly, except where a leaf or an insect touched it, sending small ripples outward. He crouched at the edge, letting his fingers trail in the coolness, feeling the slow pull of the current even in this quiet place. The air here was heavier with the scent of water and soil. Somewhere close, though hidden from sight, a bird moved through the underbrush, its rustling measured and unhurried. Samuel stayed crouched for a while, watching the light shift on the pool's surface until a small breeze came and ruffled it into a softer mirror. When he rose again, his steps carried him further along the bend. The path began to climb gently away from the creek, giving him a view back toward the apple tree. From this angle, it looked smaller, though no less steady, a dark shape rooted at the edge of the meadow. He thought of the years it had stood there, its roots drinking from the same water he now walked beside. The morning had grown fuller now. The sun's warmth had reached the meadow entirely, and the mist had dissolved into the blue of the sky. The bird calls had settled into a steady pattern, less like an opening chorus and more like the hum of a day beginning its work. Samuel slowed his pace again, not from fatigue, but from the quiet sense that there was no need to move quickly. The creek would be here whether he reached its next turn in 5 minutes or 50. At last he came to a place where the bank leveled into a wide patch of grass, and here he chose to sit. The ground was dry now in the sun, and he leaned back on his hands, letting the light warm his face. The sound of the creek ran alongside the soft murmur of wind in the leaves above, and for a long time, Samuel simply let them speak to each other. It occurred to him, as it sometimes did, that these moments, the slow walk, the steady water, the light shifting on the grass, were not apart from his life, but part of it in the most essential way. They did not fill time, they made it, and in their quiet company, he found the kind of rest that could not be rushed. By the time Samuel began to wander back toward the meadow, the morning had grown into a quiet golden fullness. The sunlight no longer slanted low across the grass but poured steadily down, soaking into the earth, into the leaves, and into the boards of the old fence line. The air held the warmth gently, not yet heavy as it would be later in summer, but enough to loosen the last traces of coolness from the night. He walked without hurry, retracing the slow bends of the creek. The water, still clear, caught the sun in places, turning it into flickers of gold that darted among the shadows. Overhead, a hawk drifted in a slow circle, its wings stretched wide, catching the invisible currents that moved high above the land. When the apple tree came into view again, Samuel felt the faint pull of it, the same quiet welcome it had always offered him. From a distance, its branches seemed to form a deep green canopy, a space that promised shade and stillness. The nearer he drew, the more details emerged, the shifty glint of leaves, the rough line of bark, the darker hollows where the light could not reach. At the base of the tree, the grass was soft from years of fallen leaves enriching the soil. Samuel lowered himself onto it with the care of one settling into an old armchair, finding a place where the trunk's curve fit the shape of his back. The ground here was cool even in the sun's rising warmth, and the air carried the layered scents of earth, water, and the faint sweetness of apples overhead. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. The sounds of the meadow seemed to arrange themselves around him. The creek's gentle murmur to his right, the faint buzz of bees among the blossoms above, the slow rustle of leaves in the breeze. Each sound held its place, none pressing forward, none fading entirely away. When he opened his eyes again, he looked upward through the branches. The leaves shifted slowly, their undersides catching flashes of sunlight as they turned. Small clusters of apples, still firm and pale, hung here and there, some within reach, others high enough that they seemed content to remain untouched for now. Samuel reached up and plucked one of the lower apples, feeling the cool smoothness of its skin against his palm. He turned it in his hand, studying the faint blush beginning to spread over one side, then set it beside him in the grass. The act was less about hunger than about having a piece of the morning to keep close. He let his thoughts drift, not in any particular direction, but as leaves do on a slow current. Some rose from recent days, small tasks, familiar routines, while others came from far earlier. The memory of sitting under the same tree as a boy, watching the creek in the heat of summer, or the autumn afternoons when he would gather fallen apples into a basket and carry them home. The tree had been here for all of it, holding its shape through each season's passing. It had watched the meadow turn green, then gold, then bare, only to return again. And in some quiet, unspoken way, it had held those years for him, storing them in the grain of its wood, in the slow widening of its rings, in the roots that reached down toward the same water he had followed that morning. A light breeze moved through, carrying with it the scent of the creek and the sharper sweetness of crushed grass from somewhere nearby. Samuel breathed it in deeply, letting the air fill and settle within him. His hands rested loosely in his lap, and his eyes half closed against the shifting play of sunlight. Time here did not so much pass as settle. The sun moved slowly, tilting shadows across the grass. A bee traced a looping path from blossom to blossom, pausing only long enough to draw what it needed before moving on. Somewhere beyond the meadow, the faint sound of a neighbor's dog rose and fell again. Samuel remained where he was, letting the day move as it wished. In the shade of the old apple tree, the weight of time felt lighter, as though each moment was held and kept rather than spent, and in that keeping he found the rest he had been seeking. Not the rest of sleep alone, but the deeper rest of knowing there was nowhere else he needed to be, and nothing else that needed doing. The shade beneath the old apple tree deepened as the sun climbed higher into the sky, shifting its light so that it now poured over the meadow in broad, steady strokes. The grass beyond Samuel's resting place glowed in the warm brilliance, while under the tree, the air held the coolness of the morning a little longer, as if reluctant to let go. He remained seated with his back against the trunk, his legs stretched out before him, one boot resting over the other. The quilt of sounds around him had thickened in a quiet, steady way. The bees above worked more slowly now, their hum deeper and less hurried. The creek moved with the same unbroken song as before, yet its tone seemed fuller in the noon air. Even the birds had adjusted their voices, trading the bright chatter of early morning for occasional, measured notes, as though they too understood the pace of the afternoon. Samuel closed his eyes for a time, letting the warmth and shade balance each other over him. He could feel the slow, rhythmic pull of his own breathing, the easy weight of the air in his lungs. The texture of the tree's bark pressed gently into his back, grounding him in its presence. A drowsiness began to settle, not the kind that demanded sleep immediately, but the softer kind that allowed his mind to wander without effort. Memories came without summoning, arriving like quiet guests who knew the way to the porch without needing to knock. He thought of summers long past when he was younger and the days seemed endless. There had been afternoons much like this one, when he had lain in the grass watching the clouds slide across the sky, naming shapes in them until they dissolved. He remembered the dusty smell of hay in the loft, the cool splash of creek water over his feet, the way the light turned the meadow to a pale gold just before evening. The breeze shifted, carrying with it a mix of scents, the faint sweetness of the apples above, the richer smell of earth warmed by the sun, and somewhere distant, the dry, comforting aroma of hay being turned in a nearby field. Samuel opened his eyes and watched a single leaf detach from a higher branch. It spun slowly as it fell, landing just beyond his boot. Though summer was still in its full green, the leaf's pale edges hinted at the season that would follow. He leaned forward slightly, picking up the apple he had set beside him earlier. Its skin had warmed in the shade, and when he held it near, the scent was gentle but sure, a blend of sweetness and tartness that seemed to carry the memory of spring blossoms and summer rains. He turned it in his hand, then set it back down, content simply to have it near. The stillness of the afternoon was not without movement. Ants traced narrow, purposeful lines through the grass, vanishing into small hollows in the soil. A dragonfly passed, its wings catching glints of light as it darted briefly into the open before vanishing toward the creek. Above, the shifting leaves patterned the grass with dappled shapes, each one altering subtly with the wind's touch. Samuel let his gaze drift past the meadow toward the far ridge, where the tree line held its steady green. Beyond those trees lay places he knew well, and others he had not walked in years. Yet from here, they seemed close enough to be gathered in the palm of his hand. Time felt smaller in such moments, as though it folded itself neatly into the present. The warmth wrapped around him more fully now, loosening the edges of thought. He did not fight the drowsiness that deepened, but let it rise like water in a slow tide. His eyes closed again, and the sound of the creek came forward, steady, unbroken, a companion as familiar as breath. Somewhere in the soft drift of near sleep, Samuel felt the quiet assurance that had always come to him here, that the land held him as much as he held it in memory. The apple tree above, the water beside, the sky stretched over both. They had shaped the rhythm of his days in ways too gentle to notice at the time, but too deep to ever lose. A bee moved near his ear, then passed on, its hum fading into the air. The light shifted again, the shade drawing longer where he sat. Samuel allowed himself to sink further toward rest, knowing the afternoon would keep its pace whether he slept or stayed awake. Here, in the cool circle beneath the apple tree, the day asked for nothing and gave all it had: the sound of water, the scent of earth, the ease of stillness. And Samuel, in return, offered only his presence, a simple, unspoken exchange that felt whole and enough. Samuel woke without a start, as though the day itself had gently laid a hand on his shoulder. The light beneath the apple tree had shifted while he slept. What had once been the bright glow of midday was now softer, warmer, touched with a quiet gold. The air had changed too. It was lighter, cooler, the breeze carrying with it a faint trace of wood smoke from somewhere far off, perhaps from a farmhouse where someone had lit the kitchen stove in preparation for supper. He sat for a while before moving, listening to the subtle rearrangement of sounds around him. The creek no longer seemed to rush. Its voice was slower now, mingling with the first tentative chirps of evening insects. The meadow, which had shimmered in the heat earlier, seemed to have settled into itself, the tall grasses swaying with the ease of a day almost spent. When Samuel stood, his shadow stretched long before him, reaching across the grass toward the low bend of the creek. He brushed off the bits of leaf and dried grass that clung to his shirt, then picked up the apple he had left by his side. Without thinking, he took a slow bite. The fruit was crisp and cool, its flavor bright against the quiet of the hour. It tasted of sunlight and rain, of seasons past, of the steady patience of the tree that had grown it. He began to walk, not away from the tree entirely, but along the slow arc of shade it cast. The light filtered through its branches in long, slanted beams, painting the ground in shifting patterns. The grass here felt cooler beneath his boots, the earth firmer where roots ran deep. As he came nearer to the creek, the water caught the evening light and turned it to bronze. Small ripples moved over the surface, each one bending the reflection of sky and leaf. He paused at the edge and crouched down, resting his elbows on his knees. The water smelled faintly of stone and silt, a scent that brought back memories of countless evenings spent near these banks in his youth. Sometimes fishing, sometimes skipping stones, sometimes doing nothing at all. A heron stood some distance upstream, still as a weathered post, watching the water with its narrow gaze. Samuel stayed quiet, not wishing to disturb it. In the hush, he could hear the steady tick of a grasshopper somewhere behind him, and the faint rustle of a small animal moving in the undergrowth. The sky above was beginning to change. The clear blue of afternoon had deepened, and thin clouds now held the low light in pale pink and lavender. The sun itself hovered just above the far ridge, and the air seemed to pause in the presence of its slow descent. Samuel wandered along the water's edge, each step unhurried. He noticed how the willow leaves caught the last brightness of the day, how the cattails swayed in a rhythm that belonged only to the evening. Somewhere nearby, the scent of late summer wildflowers drifted across the path, mingling with the coolness rising from the creek. He stopped again where the bank opened into a small clearing, a place he had often favored when the day began to lean toward night. The grass here was shorter, pressed in places by the weight of deer or the passage of small feet. He lowered himself to the ground once more, folding his legs beneath him, and rested his hands loosely in his lap. From here, he could see both the apple tree and the far reach of the meadow. The tree's silhouette was now darker against the light, its leaves trembling in the gentle breeze. It stood as it had all day, and as it had for decades, steady and unshaken, marking the slow turning of the hours. Samuel let his gaze rest there, feeling the pull of memory and the ease of the present moment blending together. This was the kind of hour he had always trusted, the quiet hinge between day and night, when the land seemed to hold its breath and all things were gently gathered in. The sound of the creek remained constant, a thread that tied the day to what would come next. Above it, the first notes of a night bird called out, clear and measured, as though testing the air for the songs yet to come. Samuel leaned back on his hands and let his head tilt slightly toward the sky. The color there deepened with each passing breath. The sun's lower edge now touched the ridge, sending a final burst of golden light across the meadow. It lit the apple tree in a way that made it seem almost lit from within, as though the years it had held, the seasons it had seen, were shining out in these last moments of day. He breathed in deeply, letting the coolness fill his lungs. There was no sense of hurry, no weight of what came next, only the knowing that the day had been enough, not because of what it held in work or in accomplishment, but because it had unfolded in its own time, and he had been here to witness it. As the sun dipped lower, he rose once more. His steps took him slowly back toward the tree, the shadows now stretching far ahead of him. The meadow seemed to welcome the coming night, its colors softening, its sounds settling into the deep, steady rhythm that would carry through until morning. When he reached the apple tree, Samuel rested his hand briefly against its trunk. The bark was cool now, its ridges familiar under his fingers. He stood there, looking once more toward the water, before turning to face the path home. The light was fading, but it was a good fading, the kind that promised rest and the quiet renewal that would come with the next day. And as he began to walk, the evening folded around him, gentle and sure. Samuel stood for a long moment beside the old apple tree, letting the quiet of the evening settle fully into him. The sun had dipped entirely below the ridge now, leaving the sky brushed with the lingering colors of dusk. Pale rose, soft lavender, and the first faint wash of blue that would soon deepen into night. Above him, a single star had already made its appearance, trembling faintly against the fading light. The air had cooled, though not sharply, and it carried with it the mingled sense of the day's last warmth and the earth's deep rest. Somewhere far off, a cow lowed, the sound stretching across the distance and fading gently into the hush. Nearer by, the first chorus of crickets had begun, their notes rising and falling in an unhurried rhythm, like a conversation that would continue all night without needing an end. Samuel took one slow step, then another, leaving the circle of shade and stepping into the open meadow. His shadow, long and softened at the edges, moved with him across the grass. The creek's voice, constant through the day, was now joined by the faint whisper of wind slipping through the taller stems along its bank. He did not rush. There was no reason to. The day was complete in itself, and the path home was short enough to be savored. Each step felt like a thread woven into the fabric of the land. The cool, springy give of the earth beneath his boots, the way the grass leaned and swayed as he passed, the gentle brush of a seed head against his sleeve. As he walked, the apple tree remained in view behind him, growing smaller with each few paces, yet never quite leaving his sight. Its shape stood clear against the dimming sky, a steady figure holding the place where the day had been lived. Samuel knew he would return to it, just as he had for years, when the need for stillness and remembering called him again. The meadow narrowed into the familiar path that curved toward the lane. Along one side, a low stone wall ran unevenly, its rough edges softened by moss and the passing of time. Samuel reached out to rest his hand upon it as he went, feeling the cool, rough surface beneath his fingers. Beyond the wall, the field lay in shadow now, the last light caught only in the tops of the taller trees. When he reached the curve where the path rose slightly, he paused to look back once more. From here, the apple tree was smaller still, a dark shape at the edge of the meadow, its roots close to the water that had sung all through the day. The sight held a quiet reassurance, as though the tree was keeping its place for him, a keeper of hours, of seasons, of the gentle turning of years. He turned again toward home, and the lane opened before him, lined with the quiet silhouettes of hedges and young maples. The moon, a pale and certain presence, had begun to rise above the ridge. Its light was cool and steady, touching the path in places where the trees led it through. The sounds of the evening deepened as he walked. The crickets' songs swelled, joined by the slow call of a whippoorwill somewhere beyond the hedgerow. A breeze passed over the fields, carrying the faint scent of clover and the sharper freshness of water from the creek. Each note and scent felt like part of a single unbroken thread, one that had run through the whole day and now led gently into the night. Samuel's steps slowed as the first lights of home came into view. In the near distance, a warm glow shone through the kitchen window, soft and welcoming. The sight brought with it the same quiet contentment as the apple tree had, a sense of belonging, of being gathered in. At the gate, he paused once more, letting the stillness fill him before stepping inside. The grass here was cool underfoot, and the faint creak of the hinge was almost comforting in its familiarity. He closed the gate behind him, the latch settling with a sound that belonged wholly to this place. As he crossed the yard, the night seemed to open wide above him. The stars had multiplied, their small lights steady and sure. The moonlight lay across the grass, silvering the edges of each blade. He breathed in the night air, feeling its calm settle deeper than thought. At the porch, Samuel rested his hand briefly on the rail, as though to anchor himself in the moment. He turned once more toward the meadow, though now it was only a dark shape beyond the nearer trees. Somewhere in that darkness, the old apple tree stood, the creek still moving beside it, the land holding the same quiet it had always known. He stepped inside, the soft warmth of the house wrapping around him like a blanket. The day was behind him now, but its peace remained, carried in the scent of the air, the rhythm of the creek, the memory of shade and sunlight passing in slow hours. And as the night closed gently over the land, Samuel knew that sleep would come easily, not from weariness, but from the steady contentment of a day lived simply, under the watch of an old apple tree by the creek. And so our day by the creek comes to a close. The old apple tree stands quietly in the night, its leaves resting, its roots deep in the earth, holding the memory of every hour we've shared. The water still moves beside it, steady and sure, carrying the last light of day into the darkness. You can leave it there now, knowing it will be waiting whenever you need to return. May your own night be as peaceful as this meadow. May your thoughts drift like the ripples on the creek, unhurried and free until they fade into the soft quiet of sleep. Rest well and let the weight of the day fall away. You are safe here. If you'd like to wander with me again, let me know in the comments what story you'd like to hear next. I'll be here, waiting by the tree, ready to tell it when the night calls you back.